they've cut back on their purchases of Russian oil. They did so because of the U.S. sanctions under the Biden administration. So they might talk about being friends forever, but they're reining in a little bit in terms of the economic relationship with Russia, just to see where it goes.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Scott is also Editor-in-Chief of EA Worldview and a regular commentator for us. Scott, good to see you again. Thanks for joining us on Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
Two senior US officials are reported to be saying the US will be unable to secure a Ukraine peace deal in the next few months. And as things stand, it does look like the prospect of even a ceasefire is unlikely for some time.
Welcome to reality. I think that even when the Trump administration entered direct talks with the Russians in February, and then they began to talk to Ukraine, most of us said it would be some time before we had even a glimmer of a ceasefire. And that is proving to be true. And the main reason is, and we need to be clear, is because the Kremlin only will accept a ceasefire if it is on its terms. And those terms effectively are still an ultimatum to Ukraine. The specifics of what have happened is that the U.S. and Ukraine got to the point a couple of weeks ago where they said, okay, let's have a partial ceasefire on attacks on energy infrastructure. Now, the Americans wanted to go further. In fact, Ukraine had said, look, we'll have a halt on attacks in the Black Sea. And the Americans said, that would be good. Look, let's also have a halt to attacks on the front line. And Ukraine, of course, which is trying to draw in the Trump administration, said, yeah, we'll take all that. All the Kremlin would agree to, at least formally, was to halting the attacks on energy infrastructure. But in fact, in the past 2 weeks, those attacks on energy infrastructure have continued. There are drone and missile strikes every night. There have been power outages in parts of Ukraine from the strikes. Last week, the U.S. and Ukraine said, okay, let's agree on this halt to attacks on shipping in the Black Sea. And they sent it across to the Kremlin. And some news organizations mistakenly reported that Moscow had agreed to it. They hadn't. What Moscow said is, oh, well, it'd be great to have a ceasefire in the Black Sea. But look, for that to happen, you have to lift sanctions on us. You have to lift sanctions on our financial institutions that handle food and fertilizer exports, the transactions for them. But they went even farther, because to do that, Moscow said, you have to reconnect our banks to the SWIFT global transaction system. Now, that covers transactions for things well beyond food and fertilizer. And of course, it was one of the big steps to limit Russia in 2022 after their full-scale invasion. So the Russians really have not made any concessions. If anything, what they've done is they've restated these ultimata. And just to put them out there, because it's important to emphasize this, they've said, look, you have to recognize our long-term occupation and indeed our annexation of not just the Crimea Peninsula, which they've had since 2014, but 4 regions in Ukraine, 2 in the east, 2 in the south. Parts of those regions are held by Ukraine because they reclaimed them in 2022. And Russia, in effect, is saying, you have to give us that territory as well, all 4 of these regions. But the rest of Ukraine has to be kept weak and demilitarized, neutral in the Kremlin's terms, which means no security guarantees from the West. Then, of course, all sanctions lifted on Moscow. And finally, last week, Vladimir Putin restated his argument, which is the Zelensky government has to go. He framed it as the UN has to bring in a transitional government, an interim government, which will supervise elections, right? At that point, I do think Donald Trump, in his Trump world, snapped. I don't think it was an actual fake where Trump came out on social media and said, we're going to impose secondary sanctions on Russian oil exports. So if someone takes Russian oil, like India, like China, we'll sanction them because Putin had made this demand that the Zelensky government would have to go. Now, Donald Trump a few weeks ago called Vladimir Zelensky a dictator, lied that he only had 4% support. But in the past few weeks, of course, U.S. has been negotiating with Ukraine. Trump has been, maybe I can get the shiny of a ceasefire deal and I get my photo with it. And now Vladimir Putin is threatening it. So the question here is, how much has the Kremlin backed itself into a corner with these ultimatum? Or, and I'll give you the sequel to this, can it get out of this with the visit of a high-level Russian official to Washington this week?
Yes, I'll ask you a little bit more about that in a moment. But yeah, interesting though, the interpretations of Trump's reactions here, they vary widely between saying when he says, quote unquote, that he was finally pissed off with the whole situation. Having said that, if you look at what he does and doesn't do, almost within the same breath, he then expresses the frustration that and threatens Zelensky over this minerals deal should he not sign a new one. So on the one hand, he's expressing anger and has he actually done anything yet in terms of leverage on Moscow? It doesn't look like it, does it? And on the other hand, he's threatening Zelensky. So at the end of the day, you could say it's more of the same.
Yeah, except in terms of the media cycle. And I absolutely take what you said about Zelensky. And we'll talk about that rare earth minerals dynamic in a minute. But the news cycle, most people focused on him getting upset with Putin because it hasn't happened before, and not on him getting mad at Zelensky because he has done that repeatedly. So in terms of news cycle, it framed up in terms of that Trump was mad at Putin. And what it did is there's a space where Ukraine and the adults in the room, the responsible Trump administration officials, and especially Europeans who played a big part in this, they still have the diplomatic initiative. Now, diplomatic initiative doesn't mean we're going to get a ceasefire. Kremlin is going to it, but it still looks like that Ukraine has the high ground, that they are the ones who are negotiating in good faith, and Russia is not. And while that impression is there, even though the Trump administration is not authorizing new military aid to Ukraine, it is not holding up the military aid that was already authorized. And of course, it's renewed the intelligence sharing. So Ukraine is in a better position now than it has been in the past couple of months. And even though Trump swings back and forth, right now there's sort of a constancy, which is that there is a Europe, US, Ukraine channel, which is keeping Kyiv in terms of we're the guys that are actually being responsible here. The Kremlin's the ones who are basically being irresponsible by standing in the way of getting some resolution.
In that light, what strategy can the Europeans and Ukraine actually pursue diplomatically with the US to keep Donald Trump on side?
You keep Trump from running after some shiny bauble, which means he goes back into Vladimir Putin's pocket. So let me flip that question by telling you where we are as you and I speak and what Ukraine and Europe have to guard against. There's a man named Kirill Dmitriev, but I think very few people would have heard of him. But he's a financier. He's head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund. So he's an investment guy. He's also a guy who has worked with the Trump camp for almost a decade. You can go back to 2017, where he had Backchannel talks, even before Trump took office, with a man named Eric Prince, who was most famous for being the founder of the Blackwater Mercenaries. Anyway, why do I mention Kirill Dmitriev? He's in Washington as we speak, 2 days of talks. He's meeting initially a man named Steve Witkoff, who was supposed to be Trump's envoy on the Middle East, but has somehow transformed into Trump's envoy on Russia. And that's not good. I'm going to be very diplomatic about what I say here, because
someone has to be.
Yeah, exactly. If it wasn't, times is held in such a regard, but Steve Witkoff, not the sharpest tool in the box when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. A few days ago, he gave an interview with the hard right ideologue, Tucker Carlson, where he talked all about Vladimir Putin loves Donald Trump so much. He's such a good friend. When Trump suffered an assassination attempt, Putin prayed for him, and then he repeated the Kremlin's lines, right? So Dmitriev's gone to Witkoff. Now, what has Dmitriev gone to Witkoff with? We don't know this. It has not been officially admitted, but a few days ago, Kirill Dmitriev said, wouldn't it be great if Russia and the US could have a deal on rare earth minerals? right? So you take the fact that Ukraine is not going to accept the U.S. ultimatum, which is what it is on rare earth minerals. Russia can fill the gap. So Dmitriev's going to try that ploy with Witkoff and then with Trump.
And this is access to rare earth minerals in Russia.
And Russian-occupied territory in Ukraine. See, this is the stinger. If Trump accepts it, what you then say is, look at this territory we occupy. You need to recognize our occupation, and then you get even more minerals from this area, right? So what does Europe and Ukraine do in the face of this? They expose what is being done. They say, look, the priority here is the ceasefire. The priority here is the halt to the killing. We can certainly talk about minerals when we have the ceasefire, but let's keep the focus on who is standing in the way of that. And meanwhile, what Europe does is continue the military and economic support for Ukraine. You don't flag on that front either.
It's interesting. I heard someone talk about Donald Trump's foreign policy as being, the commodification of diplomacy was the phrase they used. And if you had that kind of temptation with that visit to Washington that you just described, how tempted will he be with that compared to the argument that you're saying that the Europeans are using along with Ukraine? Let's get the ceasefire first. Let's not talk about the business deals. But at the same time, he's given the ultimatum to Zelensky on his proposed minerals deal. Where does he draw the line? Which way do we think he will go?
It depends on which advisors are influential in this. You have to go a little bit beyond Donald Trump. So let me add another element to the story. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, who is the one who has presented the ultimatum to Ukraine, which in effect is, we get total control over your minerals, right? And you have to repay us every bit of aid that we've given you plus interest. Ukraine is sending a delegation to meet Bessent this week in Washington. So they're going to counter the Russian move, right? But that Ukraine delegation will also talk to other officials, I suspect, such as Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor. I suspect they'll probably talk to the envoy, Keith Kellogg. And they'll try to get those guys, lined up where they then go talk to Trump. And how do they spin it? If they spin it which is, we can get a great deal with Russia, that's our priority, that's a problem. If they can spin it as, you want this ceasefire, then you still have the initiative. So we're in a wait and see mode for a few days over that. But meanwhile, this is the other thing why, and like I said, this is never a positive situation for Ukraine. They're still under threat of being conquered by Russia. But you're buying yourself time, because the interesting thing here is that the Russian advance in eastern Ukraine has slowed. They have taken some territory in the Donetsk region, but they've taken very few towns. And even that gradual advance is starting to get more limited. The Russians are running into problems. They're running into battlefield problems, and they're running into economic problems in terms of how much they can keep their overheated economy going. So even if you don't get a ceasefire, as long as Europe stays behind Ukraine and you keep Trump in play where he doesn't simply side with the Kremlin, you're doing okay.
There's been this unusual sign of cross-party consensus, 25 Republicans and an equal number of Democrats sponsoring a bill that could impose 500% secondary tariffs on buyers of Russian oil if Putin doesn't do a ceasefire deal with Ukraine. It also included gas, uranium and other products. Trump is appearing to back it at the moment. Could he effectively force President Putin to stop the war by cutting off the revenue that finances it?
Well, this is a long road that you have to do. First of all, my reading of that, that's important, 50 senators, 25 each party, a Republican, Lindsey Graham, who is a friend of Trump, co-sponsoring alongside the Democrat Richard Blumenthal. That's in the sense of being a resolution rather than a bill. Now, a resolution is largely symbolic. We would like the administration to do this. You still have to get from a stretch, which is the administration would then implement those sanctions to put them in there. And that's a big ask, because how far would Trump go when he still wants to win favor with Putin? He still wants the idea of the photo op with Putin. But I think the significance here is that the Republicans in Congress who have rolled over and accepted almost everything else Trump have done is they've set a marker down, which is they do not want him bailing out on Ukraine. They want the onus to be on Putin to make concessions. And I think that sort of, again, limits how far the Kremlin can go in terms of trying to spin Trump. Because guess who those Ukrainians who are going to be in Washington next week? Guess who else they're going to meet with? They're going to be meeting with legislators up on the Hill.
Interesting when you say they've got to make Moscow make concessions. I mean, what would be the least Moscow might do that would be acceptable?
Kate, I've always said that I think where the landing point is on this, or I should say I've said for several months that where the landing point is a parallel to where we are or where we were in the Cold War with West Germany and East Germany. And that is that Ukraine realizes it cannot end that Russian occupation of about 25% of its territory in the near future. So you freeze the attacks there. Meanwhile, you build up the rest of Ukraine with economic and military support. Now, what does that mean in terms of concessions? You don't make the Russians have to withdraw from Ukraine, but you don't allow the Russians to limit Ukraine's ability to get military assistance and security guarantees from Western partners. I think you probably would have Ukraine moving quite slowly on accession to NATO. That would probably be accepted, although they might not explicitly say it. But I think Ukraine would not accept any limitation on its path into the EU. So what does Russia get? Russia would get the territory that it holds in the short term. It would get its own security guarantee that there will not be a renewal of attacks by Ukraine to try to change that. And it would probably get at least the limited assurance that Ukraine would not immediately go into NATO. But I don't think it checks the ability of Ukraine to build up its military and economic strength. Again, the way that West Germany did, where it took 40 years. We got to be honest here. It took 40 years to get East Germany back. But in the end, West Germany did that not through a military invasion of the East. It's because it was economically and politically a far more acceptable and stable system.
The first in-depth meeting of the Coalition of the Willing is taking place in Kyiv this week, and we're speaking before that and before it's clear what might be discussed or what they might be willing to actually do. What do you think the options are for discussion?
I think it's actually ongoing from what we know that's already come out there. So first of all, what do you do in terms of supporting Ukraine regarding these talks? And that is, you make sure that even if Europe is not at the table, that Ukraine is at the table, that this does not revert back to the situation back in February of direct U.S.-Russian talks, which is where we were. Secondly, you plan for the idea that if we can get a ceasefire, what do those security guarantees mean? And those security guarantees do mean troops from some European countries in Ukraine with some air cover for them so they're not attacked by the Russians. And this is really the initiative led by Keir Starmer for the UK, Emmanuel Macron for France. You will get continued talks in terms of maintaining financial economic assistance so that Ukraine's government continues to be effective, and you maintain assurances in terms of protection of Ukrainian infrastructure, especially energy infrastructure. So you might see further commitments to Ukraine's air defenses that come out of this as well.
What do you think China is taking from the way these negotiations are unfolding at the moment? We saw Putin hosting China's foreign minister this week, and we've seen China incidentally conducting at least 2 days of military exercises targeting Taiwan with rehearsal blockade and attacks involving 71 aircraft and 21 warships.
Yeah, and I have to say up front that very close colleagues of mine with whom there's sort of disagreement on this in terms of the level of support of China for the Russians. I have some colleagues who think that behind the scenes, China's fully aiding the Russian military invasion and continues to do so. I'm more of the opinion that the Chinese are playing all sides here to keep their own options open. And by that, I mean is, they're going to continue to tell the Russians we have a strategic relationship, that's fine.
Friends forever.
Yeah, friends forever, and they'll say that. There are individual Chinese companies who do contribute components that go to the Russian military. But China's not going to give, I think, at the official level, military and economic support for that invasion to continue. I think they don't see the value of getting tied down with Moscow in what, let's be honest, is an invasion that the Russians haven't won and are not going to win for quite some time. Because remember, the Chinese also have to calibrate this in the context of the latest Trump tariff fiasco, which means they're facing 54% tariffs. They have to face it in terms of their position, in terms of their relations, not only with the US, but their relations with Europe, which they're trying to improve. So they're going to play all sides there. So what it means is, just to give you something that hasn't got as much notice, they've cut back on their purchases of Russian oil. They did so because of the US sanctions under the Biden administration. So they might talk about being friends forever, but they're reining in a little bit in terms of the economic relationship with Russia, just to see where it goes. Meanwhile, the Taiwan dimension, in this world of unpredictability, they simply are protecting their space and then seeing how much they could possibly expand, not with a military invasion of Taiwan, but with pressure on Taiwan. Because if the world is distracted by Ukraine, Russia, if the world's distracted by Israel, Gaza, they've got more leeway to keep on saying, no independent Taiwan, no independent Taiwan. And yes, you will be part of one China someday. We need to remind you of that.
Just on the, John, you mentioned tariffs, and just on the subject, if I can mention Donald Trump's so-called Liberation Day. Why do you think Russia and Belarus escaped the additional tariffs?
I think because you're in the middle of the negotiations where you're trying to get the ceasefire, and the Trump administration has taken the position that any additional economic measure against the Russians, so even before the latest on tariffs, any additional sanction in addition to that which has been taken should not be imposed. Right now, of course, we talked about the fact that they may put sanctions on secondary sanctions on oil if Russia doesn't move towards a ceasefire. But if they still think they can get the ceasefire, then they just avoid any type of economic measure. I think it's pretty much as straightforward as that. And again, that's the context in which the Kremlin has some space to send Dmitriev over to try to not only talk about no additional sanctions on us, no additional tariffs, but is there the possibility of easing some of the existing sanctions if we play nice over the ceasefire talks?
A NATO meeting of foreign ministers is underway in Brussels today, on Thursday we're talking. It's attended by the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, focusing on NATO's security priorities, investment in defence, ensuring lasting peace in Ukraine. How is Ukraine shaping the future of the alliance, do you think?
Well, first of all, notice who is not there. Where's the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth? Because Pete Hegseth is not only going to be at the NATO meeting, he's not going to be attending what's called the Ramstein format. So these are the meetings in Ramstein, Germany, of the 50 countries who support Ukraine. And that's been the main vehicle for that cooperation since 2022, just after the invasion. So, this is the first time that a defense secretary from the US has not been at the Ramstein meeting. Rubio, although he is going to be at NATO, is not meeting any individual European leaders, as far as I know. I think he is meeting Kaja Kallas, the EU foreign policy head. So, there's sort of a downgrading of the US presence within NATO. I think, there's been question marks as to whether the head of NATO for the first time may not be an American, right? Because the fact of the matter here is that you have uncertainty about Donald Trump's commitment to the alliance. You have uncertainty that's been exacerbated by the way he's handled the tariffs issue. And I just have to say, from my standpoint, at the broad level, for the first time since 1941, we do not have a U.S. government alliance with Europe. Now, we have some relationships that are still maintained. So Rubio is at that NATO meeting. More importantly, American military figures still are involved in NATO discussions. So you still have institutional cooperation within NATO. But even that institutional cooperation with NATO is threatened from another direction because of the purge of U.S. agencies that's taking place through Donald Trump and his unelected co-president, Elon Musk. So the stability of relations within NATO for planning, for logistics, and for operations is under threat, not just because of the unpredictability of Trump, but because you have a Trump administration that simply does not see the need to put a priority on continuing business as usual with NATO.
So, Scott, you've studied these things for years now. I just would to end. I just really like to get an overview from you of what your interpretation is on the security threats we're currently facing and how they've changed throughout your career.
I mean, this is the most unstable world since 1945. And I can walk it through various levels. At the level of conflict, we not only have Ukraine, Russia, which clearly is, I think, the greatest threat to European security since World War II. We've got the question of Israel's ongoing war on Gaza, which has been renewed this week, and the prospect of a long-term Israeli occupation of much of Gaza. Now, that will have knock-on effects throughout the Middle East. You've got instability in terms of whether there will be U.S. and Israel ramping up what could be an attack on Iran, or whether we get to a settlement of that situation there. You've got the competition between China and other countries, including the United. I could walk through the checklist in terms of military, in terms of geopolitical. Now we have, I think, what could be the most damaging economic situation since the 1930s. The last time we had tariffs of the level that Donald Trump has just announced. And as an umbrella for all of this, what you have is that the international system, flawed as it was, and we could talk about why it's flawed, but the international system that was created in the aftermath of World War II, you not only have it fracturing, you have arguably the United States, which was instrumental in that international system, or at least you have a U.S. government walking away from it. Now, that I think is the biggest threat that we have, but I also think out of every threat, there comes, if not an opportunity, there comes a challenge in terms of what can be met. Can Europe, and within Europe, I still include the UK, despite the B word, can Europe, including the UK and other countries, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, other countries in Asia, countries in Latin America, countries in the Middle East, countries in Africa, can you agree new rules of the game? Can you agree new economic relationships, new political and security relationships, which do continue cooperation, which continue multilateral approaches? That will not be answered within weeks or months, but we are at one of those points of history, which is a hinge point. Out of some hinge points, we get destruction. Out of some hinge points, like World War II, we got the prospect that maybe we wouldn't go down that road again. Well, here we are in 2025.
Scott, I don't think you're going to be retiring anytime soon. Come back and talk to us again. Scott Lucas, really great to speak to you. Thank you for your time.
Stay safe, stay sane.
You too. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.